again, I'm still going to do kind of what I call a lightning round today. We're going to be wrapping up with Judaism today, which is our fifth and final world religion. And then I'm going to touch on some doctrinal issues when it comes to the conversation of cults and other denominational beliefs and so forth. And I'm going to try to squeeze all that into today so that if we do come back next week together, then we'll do more of a Q&A session. And also too, there's been some, I say, pop-up questions over the last 3 or 4 weeks about how to open up a conversation with or you know, not be so combative when we're ministering and witnessing to other belief systems and so forth. And I've actually got a whole class that I wasn't planning on doing, but I may do next week about basically how to minister to people that are involved in cults and or other world religions. How to open up the conversation with them and not be combative and put them in a defensive posture and so forth. So we may do that. So anyway, we're going to cover Judaism this morning. We've covered Christianity. Well, first of all, we've covered the world religions, okay? The definition of world religions. We've talked a lot about, and hopefully you guys have a better understanding on the definition of religion, definition of theology, definition of doctrine, definition of ideology, definition of philosophy, and how a lot of times in our conversations and our thought processes, we intermingle them all together, okay, which oftentimes gets us in trouble, okay? Because we are real bad about, and I'm probably the most guilty of this, and I've had to train myself not to do this, you know, when I have a strong belief system in something, and I want to get my point across, all right? I've had to train myself over the years not to pass my value system across the table to you, all right? As opposed to taking an apologetic viewpoint and stating the facts and saying, okay, how does this tie in with what you believe and how I tie it into what I believe, and we come to some common ground together, okay? I told you that when I started off this class, one of the things I wanted to break us all of was starting out a conversation by saying, I believe, okay? Because again, that builds those defensive walls. And I think you guys are starting to see kind of a pattern that there's a different way, a different approach to go about this, to discuss different belief systems. So again, today we're covering Judaism. There's a reason to my madness as far as leaving Judaism to the last of the 5 major religions, because Judaism really kind of birthed or is the mother of all other world religions, okay? While it may not be the oldest written religion, because last week, where did y'all learn is the oldest written religion? Hinduism. Okay, so if we were following a text, all right, perspective, you know, the oldest written religion, you know, with a solid, and it hasn't really changed over time, it goes all the way back to what we call the Rig Veda, which was about 1000 BC, and that was the original writings, which is actually a beautiful poem and or songs that were written about life, man's relationship with God, all right? And then also too, how it ties in with nature specifically. Judaism is kind of an easier subject to cover also, because we Christians, okay, we know a lot about Judaism, all right, because we study the Old Testament. So let's get right into kind of the core teachings and core practices, okay? And then hopefully, if you guys have been keeping up with your notes, I want you guys to go back and kind of, I'm just hitting the treetops, you know, the major bullet points about all these religions. And I want you guys to take maybe this week and go back and lay them all beside each other, look at the core values or core belief systems of all 5 world religions, see the similarities, but also see the major differences between them. Okay, and then have a better understanding of why there's a major difference. And it's not saying that they're wrong, not saying we're right, but there's obviously, you know, something out of whack there, all right? And that you can have a better understanding of why something is not cohesive, like especially when you study Islam, you can have a better understanding of why Muhammad founded, you know, Islam, and why it was so important to him, which again, he had good intentions, but the dogmatic doctrine of Islam creates a barrier for people to know and understand it for what I think it originally intended to be. So, again, let's jump right into Judaism. Any questions so far that maybe popped up this past week about different religions? Yes?
When did Moses die? Because he wrote the first five books, right? So that was after 1000 BC?
Well,
or it just wasn't written down because it was oral?
It was oral, right? Yes, again, I choose my words, very specifically when I say the oldest written, recorded, holy text was the Rig Veda, all right? So I'm not saying that those teachings weren't around longer, but the oldest written, okay? Yes, you're absolutely right. They were passed
One
on.
of the Ten Commandments, Jesus wrote the Ten Commandments, right?
During Moses' time, okay? And we're going to get into that when we're talking about Judaism this morning. Okay, first and foremost, Judaism is a monotheistic religion. What does that mean according to our definitions? One God, but more specifically, one and only God. Okay? Because you can have Hinduism, which we see in Hinduism, where there's a supreme God. Okay, they've got multiple gods. It's polytheistic, but they have one supreme God set apart that they worship and follow.
Do Jews believe there will be a God the Son, or do they only think there's God the Father and there will never be? Because that's a little confusing.
Well, we're going to get into that here this morning. Okay. Hopefully I'll be able to answer all these questions for you, and you have a better understanding of the Judaism's position on what sets them apart from Christianity, for example. Okay. The Ten Commandments, okay, are very, very important. We just mentioned the Ten Commandments, all right? That is one of their first core belief systems, and I call it a belief system because it gave them an instruction book or roadmap to start following. These are the guidelines of how we need to live. In addition to the Ten Commandments, all right, the major theme that comes across from Judaism, okay, are two main subjects: righteousness and justice. Okay, righteousness and justice. Going back to your memory banks when we studied Christianity, what are the core teachings of Christ? Being a Christ follower. Was it righteousness and justice?
Well, it's love.
Love and
God and your neighbor.
grace and mercy. Okay, so a little different angle, worshiping and following the same God. Okay, but that's a very important point to realize and get our mental hands around, because we can kind of get a better understanding of why Judaism was so important during its time, why the elders, the prophets, etc., this is really all they preached. They didn't preach salvation. They didn't preach mercy. They didn't preach forgiveness. They didn't preach love. They preached righteousness and justice.
And righteousness being adherence to their laws.
That's correct. That's correct. Okay. So,
But Jeff, we find all those things through the prophets and the Psalms.
that's correct.
Not just righteousness and justice, but love and mercy and compassion. That's all in the Old Testament.
It is.
You can't discount it.
I'm not discounting it, but understand that the entire New Testament, we have an advantage because, again, looking back upon history, we're looking back upon historical texts. The Bible, as we follow, it's all put together for us. Okay? They didn't have the New Testament. Okay?
No,
They didn't have all the Psalms. They didn't have all the writings.
They had the Psalms.
Not until later on. But initially, they had the Ten Commandments and the teachings of Moses. Okay? The first 5 books.
David write the
So I'm not discrediting that, okay? Stick with me, okay? Just stick with me. All right. I'm just saying that the underlying baseline of Judaism, okay, is focused on righteousness and justice.
And that's why Moses was so busy, because he was meting out justice all day.
Every day of the week.
All those helpers.
He was stomping out fires. Yeah, literally, almost. Israel has a historical and spiritual significance to Judaism, okay? Not just in today's time, You know, the nation of Israel is very, very important. But Israel was what to the Hebrews back in the day, back during when historical texts started being written? It was the promised land, right? Okay, so Israel is almost become a belief system around that geographical region. In other words, the entire emphasis and focus is about being in the promised land and God's promises to his people. Hold that, I know where you're going, Jan, but hold that thought, as I always tell you, okay? So, but Israel plays a very, very important role, okay? Because I submit to you this, if Israel wasn't in the picture, if the promised land was never discussed, Judaism would not have had the emphasis that it did, okay? The Hebrew Bible, okay, is pronounced the Tanakh, okay, is the primary holy text and includes the same books of the Old Testament that we have, but in a different order. Did you guys know that? Okay, same exact books, just in a different order. Okay, our Christian Bible did a very good job of lining up in a timeline. Okay, they basically took the books, the stories, okay, and lined up kind of the historical timeline for us. Okay, I'm not talking about when the books were written, but I'm talking about the stories that the books talk about. Okay, what's the oldest book of the Bible? Written in the Old Testament. What is it? Okay, Job. Right. Where's Job? It's not the first book of the Bible, though.
No, it's not.
It's not.
And Isaiah took place during Kings and Chronicles.
Correct.
Other prophets, so it isn't chronological.
Well,
They put prophets at the end. They didn't mesh them in.
well, when I say it's not chronological, it's chronological in the sense that the Bible stories of old, in other words, what Moses wrote about, okay, the flood, the fall of man, etc., those all happened prior to all those prophets coming on the scene and prior to them entering the promised land. Okay, does that make sense?
Well, it's almost the same order, because the Tanakh stands for the prophet, the law of Moses,
It does.
the prophets
Yeah.
and the writings.
That's correct.
It's the K. Yeah.
That's correct. That's correct. But they're a little different order. Okay, not that it means a whole lot to us, but they're not the same Old Testament that we have. Okay. The Talmud, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, is another holy text. It's a collection of teachings and commentaries by various rabbis on Jewish law, and outlines the importance of 613 specific Jewish laws that were given and somewhat mandated by the current rabbis, all right, of how Jewish people need to live their life. Okay, we know, we talk about Jewish law, and we talk about how we as Christians are not under the law anymore, and so forth. But there is, I'm not going to say two separate sets of laws, but you've got the Ten Commandments, okay? You've got the books of Leviticus, for example, that talk a lot about kind of rules and regulations, okay? About unclean food and how to prepare things and how to do certain daily activities. But then the Jewish people tacked on this law book, if you want to say, that they really, adhere to, and we're going to talk about the different groups of Jews and who adheres to them and who doesn't. So they've got multiple books, multiple holy texts, as they refer to, that they refer back to all the time. All right? What does this sound similar to? What other world religion does this sound similar to? Who has multiple texts?
This one has multiple texts.
Okay. Well, they still hold true to the Quran. All right. But I'm going to lead you back to Hinduism, what we talked about last week. Hinduism has multiple holy texts. All right. We went through about 3 or 4 of them last week, and we called them reformists, if you remember. And they were Hindu prince that actually had the time to reflect, to expound on teachings and better explain what the Rig Veda meant and how it applied to modern day life and civilization, okay, throughout thousands of years. So the Jewish people have done something very similar. all right? Their holy text has actually evolved over a period of time, all right? So it wasn't like they were given one book on day one that started the Jewish religion or the Jewish faith, and they held true to it since the beginning. Okay, again, it has been over a culmination of years. Synagogue. We talk about different names for things. Hindus worship in what? Temples. Okay. Muslims worship in what? Mosques. Christians worship in church. Jews worship in synagogues. Okay. All right. Just want you to know the difference, because when someone says they're going to temple today, all right, I think assume that they might be Jewish. All right, not necessarily true. They're actually going to synagogue. All right, and or they could be Hindu. Okay, more than likely they are not a Muslim. Okay, even though they're dressed just like us. All right, if they say they're going to temple, more than likely they're going to some form of a Hindu temple. Okay. Two rites of passage. Actually, one rite of passage, one different for the boys, one different for the girls. There's a very, very critical piece of following Judaism, and that's the bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah for both the boys and the girls. Okay, and this is kind of a rite of passage, if you want to say. It's an age that they reach, symbolizing they've reached adulthood, and they've come to terms with their responsibilities of not just coming of age, but it's more coming of age, accepting their responsibilities to their faith. Okay? Some of the best parties that Danette and I have ever attended have been both bar mitzvahs. I mean, they're blowouts. They're bigger than weddings, it seems like. And so it's a true celebration for the family, stating the fact that this young person has now accepted adult responsibility and entering their path to follow Judaism. That's really the statement that's being made.
So is it sort of like a confirmation class in the Christian side?
Similar. So where did Roman Catholics get confirmation class from? I'm going to say they go back to Judaism. Okay. Any questions about the core teachings? Okay. So really, Judaism, when you boil it down, is a very simple religion. It's not overcomplicated. It's got, basic teachings and text. All right. It talks about righteousness and justice primarily. Okay, in its initial text. Is led by, they have religious leaders that we refer to as rabbis. They have a place of worship, synagogues. All right, and they have pretty much a rite of passage, the bat mitzvah and bar mitzvah, that kind of launches them not just into adulthood, but launches them into their relationship with their faith. Okay? All right. Questions? No? Okay.
You said wait.
Okay, hold that thought. Okay, good. All right. Foundations of Judaism. Okay. There technically is no founder for Judaism. Okay? Like Islam, for example. They have a founder, Muhammad. All right? There's no founder for Hinduism that we learned last week. It just kind of evolved over time. So Judaism kind of evolved over time. So there's no official founder that said, okay, this is what we're practicing, this is what we're, following, etc. But with that said, Judaism, okay, when you read the text, the Holy Text, all right, the Old Testament as we refer to, it points all the way back to their founding fathers, which was started with Abraham. Okay, Abraham is the key figure that kind of began this relationship between the Hebrew people, and because he formed what with God? Abraham formed what with God?
Covenant.
A covenant, okay?
God formed the covenant with Abraham. Abraham didn't institute it.
I agree.
God did it.
Okay, all right, but he's still, but a covenant is an agreement between two parties, right?
But God did it all.
Well, Abraham.
God-
Set it up, Abraham was there.
Abraham followed.
Abraham was asleep.
Okay, well, that's where I've got to argue with you a little bit. Okay, I agree with that. I agree. I know where you're coming from, but let's be specific about this. For there to be a covenant, there's gotta be an offering, and you gotta receive that offering. Okay? So Abraham could have rejected the offering, in theory.
And stayed in Ur.
Okay? He could have, but he accepted to follow.
Later than that.
Okay, that's why they refer to him as the God of Abraham. Remember we started talking about polytheism, monotheism, Hinduism? I submitted to you there's a possibility, all right, that Abraham and even Moses was Hindu-theistic, all right, that they followed, okay, and I don't mean followed meaning committed to, but they followed and understood that there was multiple gods, spirits. Again, they were a nomadic tribe. And up until this point, then the supreme God and Abraham formed a relationship. Okay, and he followed God's, okay, therefore forming a covenant. So it wasn't forced on him. Do you have a choice to accept Jesus Christ as your Savior?
Yes.
Okay. So, yes, God came.
I didn't say it was forced.
Oh, well, okay. All right. So, the origins of the Jewish faith are explained through the Torah. Okay, I missed an H there. First spelling mistake I found. According to the text, God first revealed himself to Abraham. All right. I made a statement when we studied Christianity that Christianity was the only faith-based system, okay, only world religion that God chases man instead of man chasing God. Okay, remember that statement? And that's what sets us apart. Now, it can be argued and understood that Judaism is similar, okay, and it is similar, and that's why I choose the word similar. But when you go through the entire teachings of Judaism, man is still trying to figure out this relationship with the God that they follow and worship. Okay? So that's what sets us apart. Okay? We as Christians believe and understand that God made this offering to Abraham, okay, therefore forming a covenant with him. And because he was kind of the first one to sign up on the list, you know, it could have been somebody else through history and time. All right, but Abraham was the first one to do it, to follow this, you know, Hebrew God. All right, Judaism believes that God made a special covenant with Abraham, and his descendants are the chosen people that will create a great nation. Okay, when was the Promised Land first mentioned to the Hebrews?
When they were leaving Egypt, I think.
Okay,
When he told Abraham to leave
that's right.
Ur,
Okay,
and I will show you the
Yeah.
land I will give to your
exactly.
descendants.
So this Promised Land has been talked about since the beginning of Judaism. We remember the story of the Ten Commandments, all right? And the movies that we've watched and said they're going to the Promised Land. But really they're going back to the Promised Land. Okay? All right, because remember how the Hebrews got enslaved in the first place?
Because there was a famine and they
There was
went
a
down
famine?
to Egypt.
Okay, so did they go get conquered in battle and taken back to Egypt?
No.
No, they went to Egypt on their own. Okay?
There was no wall.
There was no wall. That's right. There was no wall. Abraham's son Isaac and grandson Jacob are key figures in Judaism. Okay? Has anyone ever been to synagogue before? Has anyone actually been to a service before? Okay, all right. And again, beautiful services, especially if they have a good cantor, okay, which is basically a worship leader or music leader. But most services, okay, unless there's a specific time around a festival, around a holy day or something like that, really all they're doing is reading scripture, okay, oftentimes out of the Torah, and they're basically just telling Bible stories. Okay, and then the rabbi oftentimes will expound and give commentary on how to apply this Bible story to your life to better serve others. Okay, no different than what we do in a Christian church. Okay, approximately 1,000 years after Abraham is when Moses showed up on the scene. God revealed the Ten Commandments to him on Mount Sinai. Okay.
When did he date Abraham?
Pardon me?
What date do you give?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean,
Well, if you figure-
Moses was around 1000 BC. All right.
Moses was like 1500 BC.
Yeah, more 1800, even further out than that. Abraham.
Not
would
if you
be-
do the chronology, I've done it myself.
Yeah.
You go back
Yeah, with
to
the-
2000 BC.
Yeah,
Well,
well,
tell you how long-
yeah, which is about 1,000 years. So Moses is sitting here about 1,000 years.
That's like 500 years. not 1,000.
Well, 1800 to 2000 BC would be about the time of Abraham. So you're right. So that's a 1,000-year period approximately. Okay, but when you go back through the timetable of the Old Testament, okay, we can be plus or minus a couple hundred years. All right. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with that because there was also a big silent period, of course, we refer to. All right, where there's kind of like, you know, not a whole lot of writings, not a whole lot of history written down and recorded of what happened, and so forth. So, but there was approximately 1,000-year period difference between Abraham and Moses. Okay. All right, around 1000 BC, King David's son, shortly thereafter, all right, Solomon constructed the first holy temple in Jerusalem. Okay, again, key date when it comes to Jewish history. Okay, 587 BC is another critical date. The Babylonians destroyed the first temple and took the Jews into exile. Okay, so we've got a core world religion. Again, we're just covering the basics here. We've got a core world religion that started establishing itself, you know, around, 1500, 1800 as far as this covenant. It was passed down. 10 Commandments were given around 1000 BC. All right, if you want to put a timetable to it, when they came out of, no, I'm sorry, it was earlier than that.
Yeah.
When they came out of Egypt, I'm sorry, 1000 BC was when the temple was built. Well, why was this such a critical time and date for the Israelites? Now that they're in the promised land, okay, why was the temple such a critical piece? Do you
Because
think?
God lived there.
That's where God lived, right? That's where the Spirit resided. All right. So up until the temple being built, all right, there was no place. There was places of worship for them, and they had to have, of course, the temple that was established when they were in the wilderness. All right. There was other places of worship. All right, but the temple in the Promised Land was built. What's that question?
They had the tabernacle up until they built the temple.
That's correct.
So they had a place of worship.
Oh, I said that.
You said-
But they didn't have the temple, the original temple, okay? So again, all the emphasis, because it's like, okay, now we've arrived. Okay, because up until this point, they were still moving around. Yes, they had the tabernacle, they had other places of worship, but they didn't have the temple. So this is when they put a flag in the sand and posted and said, this is where we reside, this is the central figure of our religion, okay, our belief system. Okay, so then, as you can imagine, when it was destroyed, their world came to an end. When the Babylonians first came in and destroyed the first temple, their world was literally turned upside down from a belief system.
And that was after the split of the 10 tribes into 2
Yeah,
tribes.
yeah, they'd already divided. I mean, we don't have time to discuss that today, but they'd already divided and kind of segregated themselves out. All right, but still, the religious system, belief system, was still intact. Okay, whether they were living together as the 12 tribes or not, they still had the same belief system. That didn't change.
Well, at least 2 tribes.
The two tribes had it.
The other ones sort of drifted.
But they were still considered Hebrews. They were still considered Jews. They still had a core belief system. Let me ask you this. This may help us get our mental hands around it. Are you converted into Judaism, or are you born into Judaism?
Back then you were born.
Okay, so just remember that.
But there were people who left Egypt affiliating themselves with the Hebrews. There were
Correct.
people that were incorporated at various different times.
So you could be, okay, right.
So you,
So let me clarify.
So you could be converted.
You can be converted. I could convert to a Jew right now, but that doesn't make me Jewish. It makes me a follower of Judaism.
Sure.
Okay, so you were born as a Jew. Okay.
That's where you're talking the difference between a religion and an ethnicity.
Right, and that's very, very important when we get into our next discussion here shortly, okay? Because oftentimes we, not being part of that culture, not being Jewish ourselves, we can't understand this dichotomy that takes place, or the struggle that takes place between my faith and my heritage or my culture, okay? We oftentimes think they're all the same. They're not, okay? That's like saying all people from Western Europe that live in America are Presbyterian.
All Kellers are Catholic.
Yeah, and that's simply not true, okay? Yeah. Yeah. Now, the Kellys with it, L-Y, which I am, most of them are Protestant. L-E-Y, most of them are Catholic. That's how we don't associate with them. Oh, we don't, trust me. Okay, 516 BC. A second temple was constructed and later destroyed in approximately 70 AD by the Romans. Okay, so almost 1,000 years, okay, Solomon built the temple, it was destroyed, all right, and then not 1,000 years, but about 600 years later, they built a second one, and that was destroyed,
Well,
okay?
No, they 70 years exile in Babylon, they came back, they built the temple.
Right.
Herod
I know.
fancied it up.
Correct, but what I'm saying is that it was destroyed the second time.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, you talk about a crisis of faith when their core place of worship, their institution that they said this is where, our whole religion comes out of. Our belief system is where God lives. They destroyed God's house. They destroyed God's
I
house.
suppose you went to
Okay.
a crisis of faith thinking, well, they're stronger than God. I believed that God was it, and now these people destroyed, so
Yeah,
is God really that strong?
yeah, okay. So, again, just understanding we're covering the basics of different religions and their core. Okay, core means their baseline, the foundation that this religion was built on. Okay. Next bullet point. The Talmud was finalized around the 3rd century AD, and the second revision of it happened around 5th century AD. Okay, so don't fool yourself if you think that the Jewish people have been following the same Judeo belief system since the beginning of time, since Moses. Okay, it has again evolved. We call it doctrine, we call it theology. All right, but it has evolved with the times, okay? Judaism also embraces several other writings and texts or commentaries. Again, they're commentaries by rabbis, such as the Articles of Faith written by, I named the rabbi there that wrote that. Another key thing, okay, so core teachings are righteousness and justice. The promised land was very important to them. The temple, because that's where God resides, is very, very important to them. And then the big thing within the Jewish religion is observing the Sabbath. Okay? That's what, again, sets them apart from modern day Christianity. All right, but observing the Sabbath is not just recognizing that it's the day of rest. Okay? It's observed in many, many different ways when you break down and boil down different Jewish followings and belief systems, okay? It's recognized as the day of rest and prayer, okay? And we, hear all these stories about, what they do and don't do. Well, throw all that out the window, okay, today, this morning, and understand that not all Jewish people do it the same way, okay?
but their commercial society has certain things they sort of force on you. Like the hotels, the elevators, you can't push the buttons on the Sabbath. You just can't.
I understand that, but you made a very important statement there. You said commercial society. So
Yeah.
these are modern day doctrines imposed on the world we live in today.
Yeah.
But they're doctrines. They don't go back to the Torah, all right? They don't go back to, the laws that were written in the
You
Talmud.
can't find the part in the Torah that tells you how to run the elevator.
No, it's a little hard to find.
Actually, that the definition of work came out of the Talmud,
there were something like 171 different things that were classified as work that could not be done on the Sabbath. And the one that I thought was most interesting is that if your brother is out in the field and he falls into a crevasse, you can't go get him, that's work.
Yeah.
If your sheep falls into the same crevasse, you can get him. But it's out of those definitions of those 170.
But they can walk a certain distance, right? It's not that far to the
But it's,
elevator.
you know, but it's, there's 171 different definitions
Yeah.
of work.
Yeah, it
And
gets a little
pushing a
confusing.
button.
Okay, and we're gonna talk about how these different groups define that here in just a minute. Remember how when we started off this class 4 weeks ago, we talked about every world religion has different sects or denominations or breakout groups or offshoots and so forth, okay? Judaism probably has more of them than any other religion, okay? When you compare, when we talked about Islam and we talked about Hinduism specifically, remember we said they've got their core belief system, their core holy text, but then remember last week when I talked about the house rules? Okay? When you live in a different geographical area, and remember, they're tribal. Okay, they're clannish. All right, so they may have their core belief system in place, but then the patriarch, if you want to say, of the tribe or of the belief system at the time had its own spin on this is how we're going to follow, this is what we're going to do, these are the rituals we're going to perform, this is how we're going to practice our faith. Does that make sense? Therefore, breaking up the different groups, okay, and I'm mentioning here 4 of the major sects, okay, S-E-C-T-S, sects of Judaism. There's Orthodox Jews. They're typically known for their strict observance of the Jewish laws and rituals. Those are the ones that follow the Talmud to its fullest, all right?
They're the ones not pushing the elevator button.
Right, okay.
And they have little boxes sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes they do. Okay. There's always rationalization is a wonderful tool. Hasidic Jews, okay, is an offshoot of Orthodox Jews. All right, but these are ones that are familiar to us as well. But what sets them apart from Orthodox Jews? They're ultra Orthodox. Okay, ultra Orthodox. All right. So in the Christian world, we have denominations that take a very literal interpretation of Scripture. We have denominations that take a very symbolic interpretation of Scripture. And we have, like Presbyterians, kind of a combination of both. Okay, so how would you define Hasidic Jews? Very literal or very symbolic?
Literally, you said.
Very literal.
So would they be the ones, if they're Christians, playing with snakes?
The mystical
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, some.
Yeah, I mean,
No,
like
there are.
mystical
Listen.
experience.
Jewish people by nature, again, let's go back to Abraham's time. He was on the Arabian Peninsula. He was very exposed to, remember, the spirits in the desert were referred to as jinns, all right? And the Kaaba, which was in Mecca, all right? All the nomadic tribes came at certain periods of time, certain seasonal rituals and traditions around the Kaaba to worship. Abraham's people were probably no different, all right? Until he set the house rules and said, this is the God I'm going to follow. This is the God I formed a covenant with. And, we don't know how many people were in his family and his clan. We can only imagine it was probably thousands. All right? Because, again, he was the father of the Jewish people. Got it? Okay? So, again, you're not getting a better understanding of these house rules. Okay? So, Hasidic Jews are ultra Orthodox. But I want to draw attention to they're very mystical. Okay? Jewish people over time have dabbled in what Christians would call the occult. Okay, I'm not saying they're cultish, but they've dabbled in spirits. Jewish women specifically are big into fortune telling. All right, there are actual Jewish fortune tellers that they go to seek advice and counsel. All right, even in today's time. Very, very prevalent. especially when there's a large population of Orthodox and Hasidic Jews.
So is this like when the old kings went to ask the seers or whatever they call them?
It could be, it's definitely similar to that. Okay. Reformed Judaism is a more liberal group that follows progressive ideas and doctrine. Okay, they still have the core beliefs of worshiping in the synagogue, they still have the core beliefs of righteousness and justice, but they, over time, are the more progressive, we would call the liberal. Okay, so their doctrine more lines up with what's going on during the modern time that they're living in, around the cultural demands that are being put on the religious institution, and so forth. I submit to you that, to ask you a question, has Christian doctrine throughout history changed its position on different topics and issues based on the cultural demands that are placed on the religious institution? Yeah,
Well, certainly the different denominations have.
well, either way, but we have, so we're just as, so we can't point fingers and say they're wrong, we're right, because we've done the same exact thing. Okay, but again, we have to know the difference between religion, theology, and doctrine. Okay, is there any perfect doctrine that we learned over the last 4 weeks?
Doctrine?
No, because doctrine is man's interpretation of the holy text of the scripture. Okay, man is fallible, man is wrong, man is confused, and so therefore there's no perfect doctrine, absolute doctrine out there. Okay, Reconstructed Jews, this might be a term that you have or haven't heard, okay, are a sect that believes Judaism is religious civilization. This is where they're starting to combine the culture with the religion, okay, all right, so therefore religion is constantly evolving, okay, and so forth. And this became big in 1922, specifically here in the US. All right, what was going on in 1922?
The flapper area.
I mean,
Okay.
this came out of.
We just came out of World War One, okay,
And a little more liberal, like you say, the flappers, they wore the shorter skirts, they
Okay.
locked their hair, they,
okay.
a little more
And
liberal.
there was economic prosperity then.
There was, okay, all right. So Judaism was starting to enter the political world very heavily during this period of time. They were, especially here in the U.S., the community was gaining a lot of attention and gaining a lot of wealth and prosperity. Okay, and due to their hard work and kind of pulling themselves up by the bootstraps and so forth, but this is where they really kind of enter into the modern scene, is influencing religious. So this group of people, I would submit, is basically using their religious, well, let me back up. They were using their personal influence to elevate their religious beliefs to be more accepted by modern day society. Okay?
So that's like the Rockefellers, the ones that we read are doing all the work in, what, their families are doing the things in Israel. So those people,
Yeah.
they're certainly influential.
Okay. They were going to the same cocktail parties together, they were hanging out at the same clubs together, etc. This was when they were starting to intermingle, okay, the societies or civilizations together. Okay. When did the nation of Israel pop up on the scene?
48.
Okay. It only took about 20 plus years for this very influential group to pour a lot of money and influence into the world system. Okay, and I'm not just talking about money, but influence more. They were playing politics to say, we now have to go back home, put the flag back in the ground, and make this our land. Okay, so it's interesting when you really talk to a Orthodox Jew, especially a Reconstructive Jew, all right? And modern day Judaism, they may be reconstructive and not even call themselves that. They may practice as an Orthodox, but if they've got any kind of modern mindset or philosophy or theology about themselves or doctrine, when you ask a committed Jew, where not just where they live in maybe here in the U.S., they benefit from our belief, freedom of religion. They can practice the way they want to, and they're not oppressed because of it. But really, their heart is back in Israel. Okay, even though they may live in Brooklyn, New York. Okay, their heart, their religious heart, more specifically, is back in Israel. Okay, they just choose not to live there because it's not a safe, happy place to live. But that's where, so their belief system always goes back to the promised land.
So we talk about that most of the people that are Jewish in Israel don't practice. They don't practice any of these?
No, they
Or
do.
they're not Orthodox.
No, they are Orthodox. Most of them are Orthodox in Israel, you're asking?
The people in Israel, we
Yeah.
talk about that
But
very few of the people.
There are Orthodox, there's also Hasidic Jews there, all right? And there's also a big group of Reconstructed Jews that have, when the nation of Israel were formed, moved to Israel, and that's where they reside.
But we keep hearing that most of the people in Israel don't practice Judaism at all. So that's sort of not true?
They're still Jewish, because again,
They're born that way.
you're born, okay? Because again, the emphasis for the Reconstructive Jews, while they don't call themselves that necessarily, they've combined this religious title, or this religious signage, if you want to say. And I'm born a Jew, so my civilization and culture, I'm Jew, therefore I'm a religious Jew. Okay? But that's where we get in the terminology where you're not practicing Jew. Okay? Is anyone a practicing Presbyterian?
I don't know what that would look like.
Well, let me ask you this: are you born into Presbyterianism, or are you converted?
Some
to
of us
Well,
were.
I was born into Presbyterianism, yes.
Some of
Okay,
us
so you are doing the same exact thing that the Jewish people. I'm born a Jew, therefore I call myself a Jew. I just don't go to church every Sunday.
But to parse what he was saying, that I think are the majority of people who live in Israel Jewish, whether practicing or not? Because because of the I hesitate to use the term Palestinian, but the non-Jewish people who
Lives
live
there.
there, I don't know if they outnumber the number of Jewish people there. And Larry Wallace was telling a story of a young woman that he met that was taking advantage of going to school for free and everything. And he said, "But you're not a Jew." She said, "But I'm an Israelite." So there's a differentiation between being an Israelite. She was Muslim, but she was taking benefit of all of the Israeli laws,
Okay.
but she's not Jewish. So then the question is that most people, or more people who live in Israel
Right.
are not practicing Jews. That may be a true statement.
Right. Little Bible trivia. When we mix up, we call them Jews, we call them Hebrews, we call them Israelites.
Mhm.
It really depends on the timetable you're talking about throughout history, right? Okay. When were the Hebrews initially referred to as the children of Israel?
Children of Israel.
After
Well,
Jacob studied,
Jacob.
had his name changed
That's right.
to Israel.
Right.
So then his 12
Okay.
sons were
So-
all the children
so
of
his
Israel.
descendants began the children of Israel.
Right.
So they're right in saying we're all children of Israel because one of their forefathers was Jacob, which took on the name Israel. Okay, little Bible
Which
trivia for
is,
you.
which is another piece of the confusion, which was what I was gonna say, a long time ago, and you said, hold it.
Hold it.
I held it. Israel is a place, Israel is also a family.
Correct.
Children of Israel, descendants of Jacob.
Right.
So when we're talking about Israel, we have to, are we talking about people?
So if I
Or are
want-
we talking about a place?
Well, so if I want to convert to Judaism because I want to marry a nice little Jewish girl, and Dad won't let me unless I convert.
Your wife will be upset about
Okay,
that.
okay. All right, because again, that's how people were converted to Islam. All right. I wanted to marry this nice little Muslim girl, but Dad won't let me until I convert. I may be Jewish, practicing Jewish faith, but I'm not a children of Israel because I'm not born into it. That's the big distinction. Okay,
But your kids are.
only because of the mom,
Yeah,
not because of me.
But that, the lineage
Mhm.
the importance of it goes through the mom.
I agree, okay. Does that happen in Christianity?
Yeah, Ireland only traces the family through the mother.
The mother, right, so
Because in
Christian
Ireland, they
versus,
say, we always know who the
Yeah.
mother is.
so we Christians kind of stole that from Jewish culture and heritage as well. Okay, so we practice Judaism in very different ways. We may not be worshiping the way they do, but we practice Judaism because Judaism is really a group of laws and rituals.
Well,
Okay,
and the way they worship has changed through time.
It
How
sure
they
has.
worshiped with the tabernacle was not exactly how they worshiped once they had the temple.
That's right.
When they did no longer have a temple because of the exile,
Right.
worship was different. When they came back, they rebuilt the temple, but it was probably still somewhat changed.
absolutely.
So what worship looks like is different.
Yeah,
What worship looks like in this building is different.
yeah,
From 8 o'clock to 10, whatever, to
Yeah.
11,
yeah,
it's all different.
right,
What's the same is God who we are worshiping.
right.
And how we do that depends on who we are,
Agreed,
more than any list of stuff.
agreed.
So we think that Jesus ended the sacrificial system, but why did the Jews think that it ended?
They don't have a temple.
Depending on the sect that you're part of, there are actual Jewish people, and I'm not talking about completed Jews as we refer to them. There are actually Jewish sects, very small group, that actually do believe that Christ was the Messiah, but they still worship as a traditional Jew.
But before
It's
they had
still
all
synagogue.
these routine animal sacrifices,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Virtually all the time.
Again, the temple was destroyed. They don't have a place to
They
do
don't
that
have a
anymore.
place to do it.
They don't have a place to do it anymore.
Synagogue is not a temple.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Synagogue is nothing more than a house of worship.
But they have, there's stories about out in the desert when they sacrificed to something or other, right? So,
That was in
Yeah,
that was in a tabernacle.
yeah,
No,
so they
out-
still did it.
In the desert.
Yeah, in the desert, there was a
So,
tabernacle.
so before the tabernacle even, there were
Yeah.
sacrifices out in the desert.
Yeah.
Once they had a tabernacle, we're consolidating. When Israel and Judah separate, Jeroboam says, well, I don't want them going to Jerusalem to sacrifice because I'm gonna lose my position. So we're gonna have sacrifices up here in the city of Dan. So we're gonna have sacrifices in Samaria and sacrifices in the north. So there were sacrifices other places.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's why I say we as Christians, because we got the Bible, okay, to study, we have an advantage looking back on history and kind of putting together the pieces of the puzzle and how the dominoes fell together. All right. So therefore, we have a unique advantage looking back on Jewish history specifically. Okay. A couple final thoughts. Okay, that I really think are important to discuss. Okay. What I'm about to read to you and say to you, I want you guys to look at from a not a different perspective, but I want to be cautious as to how we think as Western European Christians, okay? And that's a key thing and why I draw that attention, all right, in how our perception of Judaism, okay, as a religion is perceived, okay? I'm not talking about Jewish culture, I'm talking about Judaism, okay? So dating back to the time of Moses, Judaism and its followers have often been portrayed as victims, okay? Drawing on the sympathies of the current generation, in other words, the current group they're telling the stories to, okay, through the telling of their historical struggles for preservation, okay?
Well, if you go to the Holocaust Museum, there's this whole section about how we, the Christians, caused the Holocaust, which we wouldn't
Yeah.
agree with exactly.
Okay, so I made that statement in saying, and that's not being anti-Semitic by any means. I'm just saying that the recordings and the writings, and again, when I say modern day, I mean modern day even 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. I'm not just talking about modern day today. Everything that we read, learn, and hear about the Jewish culture, the Jewish people, has always come from that victim mentality. Okay? All right, so when we started off this class 4 weeks ago, and I can't remember the nice lady that, she hasn't been here since, maybe I ran her off, but she was the one that popped up and said, our country was founded on Judeo-Christian values.
That's Ann,
And, okay. I agree with that statement, except for the fact that this whole marketing, and I'll call it a marketing term, okay, Judeo-Christian, really weren't put in the same sentence until probably about 1950s, 1960s. Okay? So whenever you hear that, okay, sentiment, so we can say yes to that because we follow and we study the Old Testament, we follow and adhere to the Ten Commandments, and we believe these are good moral laws to live by.
But they were on the Supreme Court long before whatever year you just told us.
They
They're in
were.
our buildings.
I agree with that. I'm just saying that this buzzword, this Judeo-Christian value system, really has been a kind of a modern day in the last probably 100 years, okay, of when we've heard this buzzword. Now, again, going back to the Reformists of 1922, all right, the nation of Israel being established in the 40s, okay, so I submit to you this, there's nothing wrong with saying that, because I'm not disagreeing with that, but consider it that it's a rallying cry to get Western European Christians behind the movement, or to give credence or understanding to why we should back Israel. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay, so is it politically driven? Possibly. Does it have some scriptural basis? Yes, it does, because scriptures are very clear. Those that stand with Israel will prosper, and that's how we justify evangelical Christians saying we've got to be behind the Jewish people. And I'm not in disagreement with it. But we also, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means, well, I am to a certain degree, but when we go back over U.S. history, especially in the last 100 years, jockeying for position, especially in the Middle East, all right, a lot of times what we buy into, there's kind of a different reason for doing it behind the scenes. Would you agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm not asking you to dig into all that. I'm just saying that this whole catchphrase of Judeo-Christian values is true, but it's a more modern rallying cry. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay.
So then that sort of gets to this thing I keep worrying about. Is this Israel from 1948, is this man's will, or is this really God's will playing out?
Well, if you are I'm not going to classify or stereotype as a doomsdayer, but if you are very apocalyptic in your interpretation of Scripture, and that's what you're hyper-focused on, which we have denominations that are hyper-focused on it, they use that as the timetable of when the clock starts ticking,
Yeah.
okay?
But it's like
Yeah.
they're trying to force the timetable.
Right,
Something.
yeah.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm not disagreeing with you. So that's a personal question you have to answer for yourself. You know, is the nation of Israel, I mean, are they definitely God's chosen people? Scripturally, we believe that it's
Yes.
infallible scripture. We don't doubt or question that. Is it important for them to have their place on the map?
Yes.
Nothing wrong with it at all. Okay, because again, understanding why that now is so important, because the temple, the promised land, is critical to not just the evolution of the children of Israel and the Jewish faith and following, but it is just again, I can't emphasize the importance of this belief system. This belief system, if it wasn't for the promised land and the temple specifically, all right, the belief system would have collapsed hundreds of years ago, and we wouldn't even be talking about it today. All right, a couple historical events, and this is where, remember and again, I think we and I classify ourselves, I think we all came from Western European descent, most or all of us sitting in this room. We testify as calling ourselves Christian followers, and we can say proudly, we wave the flag and say we've always been behind the Jews. Okay? Well, I'm drawing attention to a couple times in history, and we can talk about hundreds of these, but these are events that probably weren't our finest hour when it comes to being part of Western European civilization. The first one is the First Crusade, okay? There was how many crusades? Anyone know?
So,
7. Okay, good. Are you a history buff?
I do have taught history.
Okay, good, okay, all right. During the First Crusade, okay, when Western Europeans entered into the Middle East, all right, they were there to conquer, to,
make it safe for Christians to visit.
okay,
The Muslims were restricting,
Okay.
torturing, killing.
but you're making a statement that you're assuming that Jewish people were putting out the welcome banner, okay? That wasn't.
No, I'm talking only what I know is that the Muslims were making
Okay.
it unsafe for
Okay, and
Christians to
that's true,
come.
that's true. But when the first Crusaders went in, okay, you either converted to Christianity, whether you were Jewish or Muslim, or you were killed.
Oh, so they're just like the Islam, the Muslims.
It's like Muslims.
Yeah, so Muslims don't convert. Well, you do convert, or you're
Yeah,
killed.
yeah.
So you got one option, okay? So the
Well,
first,
that's
so
two
the first
options.
Crusaders did the very same exact thing. Okay,
But don't you think that's historically true?
what's that?
I'm conquering you, you either do it the way I want you to do it, or you're dead.
Well,
I think down through time, that's,
Except the Romans didn't do
I was
that.
just gonna say,
But-
that with the absorb,
The Romans did the Pax Romana is when they conquered a country, is they left intact their language, they left intact, and they brought and put Roman on top of it.
but that's,
But
People
they
didn't
didn't
rebel.
kill people that didn't worship Roman gods.
Yeah,
that's more modern than the Babylonian captivity, the Assyrians.
Yeah,
Like,
but the
I
first
think-
crusade was pretty modern
I
for its time too.
understand,
Yeah.
but I don't think it was a new concept, is what I'm trying to say.
No, it wasn't, it wasn't.
I think Pax Romana was
What's
a
that?
new
Yeah.
concept.
1095 was
Yeah,
first
that's
crusade.
exactly right.
But it was,
Well,
So-
one of the things is that, and I have the book of Crusades, and maybe we'll teach that soon, is the first crusade was not actually one of the first. There was the Children's Crusade, which was before the first crusade. And then there was a crusade to remove all Jews from Germany. And then there was another one, which you reference here, is to remove all the Jews from Spain. But those were not counted as the seven.
No, they weren't. They weren't.
They were not
They weren't a
counted.
crusade.
Yeah, they
What were they?
were crusades,
Well-
but they're not, they weren't,
Crusades to
Yeah.
the Holy Land.
they were crusades to the
Yeah, that'd be
Holy
good,
Land.
okay. So let me continue on. Okay, so if you've never studied these certain events in history, go back and do some reading. Not light reading, but there is, so again, I want to caution us as being Western European descent, saying that we've always been behind this Judeo-Christian assimilation between the two cultures and belief systems. The next one, 1492. What happened in 1492? Columbus sailed the ocean blue. All right, there was an actual decree that was laid down to expel. If you were Jewish, you either converted to Christianity or you're out of our country. Okay, again, not the finest hour. The Holocaust, of course, is the one that's most within our generational reach with our parents and grandparents. The Holocaust is a little different spin though. And when I say different spin, it wasn't just to expel, it was to eradicate. Okay, all right, so it took on a little different layer of meaning, if you want to say, when you compare. Now, how many of you guys are from up north? Were born and raised up north, okay? Where up north?
Michigan.
Michigan, okay? I'm not gonna hold that against you, all right?
Upstate New York.
Upstate New York, okay? Everybody else is Southerners in here?
No,
Okay.
Western.
Western?
Capital.
Okay, all right.
Illinois.
I'm a proud Southerner. I think Bill is too. We've talked about it, okay? I know you guys probably are being from Alabama as well.
In Texas.
And okay, Texas, okay, I didn't know that, okay. We all take pride in where we came from, whether it be Southerner or Northerner or from a certain state, following a certain football team, whatever, okay? But there was something that happened in US history back in 1862 okay? Not its finest hour. General Ulysses S. Grant actually was probably the first, I shouldn't say the first, probably the most outspoken, okay, anti-Semitic politician we've had in U.S. history. Okay, so those of you from the North take great pride in, you know, we did it the right way when we conquered the South during the Civil War. Okay, little timetable. In 1840, there was only about 15,000 Jewish people living in the U.S. in 1840. Fast forward to 1860, right before the Civil War took place, there was approximately 200,000. Not a lot, but a lot compared to a 20-year period of time. So most of them, of course, migrated from Western Europe, where there was a lot of repression. They couldn't get jobs, they couldn't live, they couldn't worship the way they, you know, were taught and raised. So they came to the U.S., the land of freedom, freedom of religion. In 1862, during the Civil War, whenever the conquering general, okay, Ulysses S. Grant specifically, there was one time period where he actually came into a town, took it over, and he set up martial law, okay? There were what they call general orders. Ulysses S. Grant actually wrote a general order, and when they took over a town in Kentucky, and basically said, if you're Jewish, you got 24 hours to leave town. So they exiled all Jewish people that lived in these southern towns as they took them over. So I tease about that being northern and southern. The Southern Baptists were more receptive to the Jewish people than the religious beliefs of the North, which were the Methodists. By the way, he was Methodist, all right? The Lutherans and also the Presbyterians.
But was that a teaching of those churches or just his personal teaching?
Well, it was personal belief, but again, they were born and raised in the church. They had doctrinal values they believed to be true. Post-Civil War, when he became president and was also very influential in the Senate, he actually tried multiple times to pass a reclassification of the people, okay? When the Emancipation Proclamation was written, okay, which freed the slaves, the biggest fear was that the Jewish people were going to be the next group of people they got to deal with, okay? So, with that said, we need to be very careful when we think that in the back of our minds we've always been supportive. We haven't been as a people, all right? And that the Jewish population has always been the not just the underdog, but the group of people that we've always thought less of. Okay, so anyway, a little history lesson for you today. Did anybody know a little bit about that story? Okay, all
I
right.
think it's so important to know
Yeah.
your history, the good and the bad.
Yeah.
No,
So again, this whole Judeo-Christian rallying cry has really been a modern day, and I say probably within the last 100 years, really come to the forefront of discussion and argument, okay? Anybody got their world history notes? I see you got yours there. Okay, we studied Judaism primarily, because I want to hold it to the last, but it's the smallest percentage of the 5 world religions.
Yep.
So we don't study it because it's,
0.2.
0.2% of the world population. So we don't study it because it's very populous. We study it because it's our mother belief system that kind of created and birthed all other systems that were taking place. Okay? I want you guys to do something else when you compare the core belief systems of the 5 world religions. Okay? I want you guys to get out a world map. Okay? And look at where India is, where the Middle East is, where Western European, we consider kind of dividing lines took place. And kind of, maybe put a little dot on the map during these time periods, 1000 BC, 500 BC, what was going on, where these stories were being told from, okay? And you'll see how these religions, okay, and I say religions, not belief systems, but religions, all kind of robbed from each other, okay? So while Judaism is the oldest monotheistic religion that we study, Hinduism is the oldest Hindu-theistic religion that we study. They've all kind of robbed from each other over time, as far as rituals, as far as belief systems, as far as theological debates, etc. Okay. All right. Questions, concerns, feelings?
Now, let's clarify, did you say Moses did not write down the Pentateuch?
No, he did.
Word for word?
Well,
They
that's
read it every time they got together, they read the entire thing.
that's debated whether or not
It
he
says
actually.
it right here, it
Well,
says it
well,
up.
he penned it definitely, but did he have help to scribe it? I don't know, and it really doesn't matter. Either way, they were his words.
Yeah, because they reread them, it's the second generation, they
Correct.
reread the entire
Correct.
law of Moses,
Yeah,
from top to bottom.
yeah.
And they
Yeah.
wrote it in highlights, they wrote it.
Oh, that's what I thought.
Like just like the Quran, we learned Muhammad didn't actually write the Quran. They were spoken words, but he had someone else scribe it for him. So was there a loss in translation? Possibly.
Well, I read something in, I'll see if I can get the validity, is that Muhammad dictated to 7 different scribes.
Okay, yeah, probably
And so there were 7 different, I mean,
Yeah.
all at the same time.
Yeah, I know.
And where there was a conflict is that someone would say, well, this one says this and this one said this is the basis of the Quran.
Right.
Is that he said, well, I said what I said and they heard what they heard. So he didn't resolve the conflict.
Right.
It was not until and this is where I've got to just nail down the date, is that like the 12th century, 13th century, one imam got all the copies together, justified all the errors and came out with the one Quran and destroyed the rest. So,
And I think that fits in with something, part of our problem with what's the oldest written, scriptures is what has been done historically to those documents. And when a conquering people came in, one of the things they did was they destroyed whatever library existed.
Many times.
So Moses could very easily have had, papyrus copies
Yeah.
that were read, scrolls that were read, and various times when people conquered Jerusalem, stuff was burned, stuff was destroyed, and who did a lot of the conquering, especially after 600, 700, was Muslims.
Right.
So we have more of their stuff because they got rid of our stuff.
Yeah.
And we have the Dead Sea Scrolls because they didn't find it first.
Right.
well, correct me if I'm wrong, is that none of Moses' writings or any of the current Gospels have been found. I think they've recently found some, but nothing has been written in Aramaic, which was the original language. They've not found the original Aramaic. The closest thing they have was the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's the oldest date that we have.
You say New Testament or Old Testament?
Old Testament.
Oh, wait, Old Testament.
Old
Okay.
Testament
Okay.
is that there, but even in the New Testament, that was not written in Aramaic or Hebrew. It was written in either Greek or
Or-
Some of those parts of it are Aramaic, but mostly Greek.
Yeah, right.
it's mostly Greek.
Yeah.
So you have, what's the Q document
Right.
from which all of that came?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Q document may be older than everything, but we don't have it.
Yeah. That made me think about Southern pride, our heritage, our culture, where we came from. Interesting read for what I'm gonna put a plug in. I don't get any royalties off of promoting this book. There's a book, it hasn't been widely circulated, but it talks a little bit about that, how the Irish saved civilization.
Yes.
Okay, have you read it? Yeah,
Yeah.
very, very interesting read.
How the Irish say.
Saved civilization,
And the
so.
same guy wrote how the Jews did something or other, and I can't remember
Yeah.
what, it's both fascinating
Yeah.
books.
And Goodreads, it doesn't really solve the argument, but it makes you think a little bit differently about how different texts and so forth were saved and kind of smuggled out of the area, taken to Ireland specifically, how they were rescribed by the monks there, and how they were protected. And it's kind of like a mystery novel almost.
Just-
how it's done.
Just read while I was on vacation, again, I have to just get the whole thing, but they found a different chapter of Mark. A different chapter of Mark underneath a current chapter of
Chapter
Mark.
one. Interesting.
Because they would scrape the ink off
Okay.
and write, and so now they're just now starting to be able to read the other chapter of Mark, which is either missing, a missing chapter or a revised chapter.
Okay.
And that's just like within the past 2 weeks that's been published.
So any questions about Judaism? Did you learn anything today that you didn't know? Okay, what?
Let me ask you a question. You said something at the very start today about why Muhammad founded Islam.
Uh-huh.
What's the answer?
If you go back to the notes we had,
Yeah.
he was disturbed by what was taking place, the pagan rituals that were taking place around the Kaaba. Okay, again, he grew up as a youngster there, and so really his intention of kind of getting rid of these pagan rituals was really a good thing, but he also had an economic motive. Because again, when he was run out of town to Medina, all right, this was his first flight, and then he came back to Mecca after he gained influence and wealth and rallied the troops per se. They came back and took over Mecca, and then kind of controlled the trade and the tourists. Remember, I said the Kaaba was probably the very first tourist roadside trap, to where you had to pay to get in and see it. That was so.
So in answer to your first question, I think, and I think this was mentioned before, so I wouldn't say this hurt today, but the fact that in the days of Abraham and Moses, they were likely, and I think the scriptures show this reference to many gods.
Yeah.
You just kind of get it stuck in your head.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with saying
Abraham
that.
was like,
Yeah, it wasn't like Abraham was, worshiping idols.
right.
But did he believe in
He had a lot of
spirits and
choices.
powers
Yeah.
out there? Yeah. So, but he said, "This is the one supreme God that I'm going to follow," after forming the covenant with him. So that's what's important to focus on.
I looked at that, Thomas Cahill wrote.
Cahill,
How
yeah,
about
I couldn't remember his
And
name.
the one about the Jews I just spoke, it's called The Gift of the
The
Jews.
gift of the Jews.
But he's got several that are just fascinating books.
Yeah.
Thomas Cahill, with a C.
Yeah. All right. Let's close out in prayer. Next week, I've already got the notes prepared. We didn't get to them today. But next week, we're going to cover, not cults, but twist. I refer to it as twist on modern day doctrine. Okay?
How to start a cult.
Listen, you'll be a millionaire if you do. So everyone says, if you want to be a millionaire, create a new religion, or start a church, or start a cult, and you'll be an overnight success. Okay. All right, Father God, again, thank you for bringing us your house together. Just thank you for the love that's around these tables. Thank you for the energy and the insight that you provide us when we kind of study who you are and what you're all about. Again, hopefully we can grasp something out of this discussion to apply to our lives to better serve you. Take us safely from this place and bring us safely back once again next week. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.